What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we have on a special guest. There's been so many injuries that it's all over my head. I can give you, a guesstimation of what's going on or when players will be back, but I don't really have a clear grasp of the actual injuries or how long it takes to work back from these things or what the re-injury rate is. We brought somebody much smarter than me on today. We have Tom here. How's it going?
I'm good, Ron. Thanks for having me on. Big fan of your show, and I'm always down to talk injuries. So I'm really excited.
Now, you do work for the fantasy injury team. I am curious. I know you have a lot of I'm not trying to say like acronyms in your username here on Twitter. What's kind of your background?
Yeah, good question. So I'm a doctor of physical therapy, and then after PT school, I went and pursued a specialization in orthopedics. So that's what the OCS letters are. And then after that, I decided to further specialize in manual therapy and more orthopedics. So that's what the one that start with the F. So that's for the fellowship in orthopedics and manual therapy. So I've got quite a bit of knowledge and experience with injuries, with
Yeah.
sports injuries, but also just with, the casual person with neck pain, back pain, rotator cuff repairs, etc. I've seen pretty much all of it, worked with pretty much all of it, and I love talking about it.
And now you also do work for the fantasy injury team as well. What's your guys' whole page about?
Yeah, so a little over a year ago, I started the fantasy injury team. This will be our second season. And essentially, I created a website where, one, we have weekly blogs where I kind of go, player one, player two, player three, and talk about their injury and how we can expect it to impact their fantasy production either this week if they're coming back and playing, or how long we would anticipate them being out for, and when they do return, are they going to be full go right away, or would we expect it to see a bit of a hit on their fantasy production in those first games back? And then also, if you're on fantasyinjuryteam.com, you'll see on the menu up top that says injury list. So I've written a thorough, detailed, evidence-based article on, I believe at this point, it's 15 or 16 of the most common injuries in football. Explain all the nerdy stuff like the anatomy, how the injury happens, what the rehab's like, what the recurrence rates of these injuries are. But then we've also looked at the pre and post injury fantasy data. So for a number of these injuries, we've calculated, how many points was that player averaging before the injury? How many points do they average as a conglomerate by their position? How do they do in that first game after the injury, or the second and third game after injury, and so forth? And we're also looking at snap percentage too. So we're getting a good idea of if these teams are usually holding these players back a little bit when they return from injury, or do they just let them ride as they were pre-injury? So that's the website, and then we have a weekly podcast, Fantasy Injury Team, on all the platforms, and this season we're really diving into YouTube as well. So a lot of content, a lot of different places you can find it.
I love it. Now your day to day, you're doing a lot of I guess you're dealing with patients, doing like physical therapy. My mom, I've talked about this on the channel before, but she had an Achilles repair actually done. She had something where I don't know, like I think maybe she was born with one of the Achilles were a little bit too short and it was hurting her back or something. And she said she hated physical therapy where like she actually, it's funny, she said that she would rather have birth again than go through another Achilles repair and then do that physical therapy. So I guess what's that like to all of your patients? I imagine some of them I imagine are doing like the extensive recoveries probably it's not the best time, I guess.
It's so interesting because in like your mom's case, that is a lot of people, and I understand that. Like someone who had an Achilles repair, they're probably coming to see me 3 times a week for
Yeah.
a while, and as they get further out, back down to 2 or 1 times a week. But still, that's a lot of time commitment and the rehab is not always fun. I mean, it's
Yeah.
working out, but also um, if it's a major surgery, we're really carefully pushing the ranges of motion to restore range of motion, and that can be really, really painful. So I mean, I pretty much everybody when they're done PT, they're like, Thank you so much, but I hope I never have to see you again. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I get that. I totally get that.
Now, I am curious, kind of like I guess that sort of leads us into. I do want to talk about Breece Hall and Javonte off the top of sort of like what do you think that their ACL recovery has looked like this summer, and kind of what do you think? I guess they're two separate cases, but I don't want to jumble them in together. But I'm sort of curious your thoughts on the two running backs with the ACL repairs, kind of what they've been going through, and then sort of what you expect for them early on in the season.
Yeah, and these really are two different cases. So let's start with Breece Hall because his was more traditional. He had the ACL tear. We know he had a meniscus injury as well, but it never sounded like they needed to repair the meniscus. There's a lot of factors that go into if they'll repair the meniscus, one being how significant of an injury is it. Millions of people walk around this earth with meniscus injuries and have absolutely no effect of it. So if it's a small enough injury to the meniscus, and depending on where in the meniscus it is, they may just leave it alone and it may not be a problem. If it's a big enough tear that's really obstructing range of motion and can't get the swelling under control, etc., if possible, they'll repair it, especially when the person's already having an ACL tear. Sometimes they'll clip it out and good to go. But in his case, from what I've read, it sounds like they just left it alone. So we're treating this as a pure ACL repair, nothing else. And that's the best case scenario when it's an ACL tear. Because with that, you're able to start fully weight bearing right away. You're able to be a little more aggressive with the range of motion right away. And generally, things are smooth sailing. So within the first couple of weeks of an ACL rehab, we want range of motion to be looking really good. We want quad activation, or like literally the ability to tighten up the quad muscle. That gets like massively deteriorated after an ACL surgery. So we want that to come back really, really fast. And we want them to be able to walk pretty normally. So in Breece's situation, where it's only in the ACL tear, he was able to do all those things right from the start. And at no point did it sound like there's been any setbacks in his rehab. And we've seen him, I know there's reports a couple months ago, like hitting 23 miles an hour sprinting. That's nice, but straight line speed's so much easier than the stop and go after this kind of surgery. But even still, I mean, he's going to play this week, and it sounds like everything has been on track. Now, as far as Javonte goes, I'll talk about him, and then I'll talk about what it's kind of the history of running backs coming off ACLs looks like. Javonte had an ACL, LCL, and posterior lateral corner injury. That's a lot. That is a massive injury. So with that, the initial phases of rehab are so much slower and more careful. Like we're talking very limited range of motion for the first couple weeks because you need to let these tissues heal. And if you bend the knee too far, too early, you may disrupt the surgery. We're also talking not weight bearing for several weeks. So anytime you're not putting your weight through a limb, it's going to rapidly weaken. I mean, rapidly. So once you get to about 6-8 weeks post-op, things are about the same as the pure ACL tear, but those 6 to 8 weeks, you can be so far behind simply because range of motion can be hard to get back at that point and so much weaker from not putting weight through it. So the fact that Javonte was never on PUP and is going to play week 1 is absolutely remarkable. Remarkable, and an absolute testament to how hard he must have been working. And it's just amazing to see because there are so many things that could have gone wrong and everything's gone right per all the reports. So that's been really, really cool to see. Now, with both of these guys, what we need to consider is that since 2017, running backs in the season after entire season after their ACL tear, their first season back, if you take their points per game and compare it to their pre-injury points per game, 35% decline in that first season back. Now we start to see an improvement later in the season. So usually it's like the first half of the season sucks and then they start to get better. But we don't really see them hit their pre-injury levels until year 2. Now, year 2, the numbers are much better. I mean, we saw Saquon really kill it last year. Dalvin Cook a few years back, the same thing. And there's other examples. So I love what I'm hearing about both of these guys' recoveries, and they're incredible athletes before their injury. And it's very tempting to be like, oh, they're going to be league winners this year. And I think they will be relevant. but I think we're a little naive to think that they're going to be at the same level that they were prior to their injuries last year.
Yeah, exactly. Especially out the gate as well. I think I have both outside of my top 30 running backs, but they're guys that for this week, if you're in a tough, if you're sort of, like I don't think that they are must sits in a way, but they aren't guys that are like priority starts. So if you have, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like fringy guys. I don't know if you're debating between like Jalen Warrens and Kenneth Gainwells and stuff. I think at that point you should play them. But yeah, I would sort of temper expectations out the gate. But it is pretty crazy how far along that they are. I will say as well, we do have some other guys. I think that the sort of the hot topics right now has been the tight ends. I did want to talk through Mark Andrews because it seems like it came out of nowhere with Andrews, where I think it's a quad injury and he just popped up on the injury report. And honestly, I was streaming yesterday. People are sort of freaking out about it. I'm sort of curious, what's sort of the actual timeline been with Andrews, and kind of what are your expectations for what the next, I guess, like 24 hours look like for him?
Yeah, this is a really good one to talk about because sometimes what these teams will do is just say, oh, he's hurt, but not give us any more information, which that always confuses me because most of the time they do give us more information, and I feel like they are required to give us more information, but every now and then they just will say, oh, he's hurt, undisclosed. And that was the case for several weeks with Andrews, and then yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, we found out that it's a quad injury. Now, at the time of this recording, 11:15 a.m. Eastern on Saturday, he is truly questionable, game time decision. Let's consider the injury that he has. The quad is one of the most powerful, strongest, and most utilized muscle in athletics that we have. So if you're going to sprint, cut, jump, you are using that quad aggressively. So when it's more acute, like if this injury happened in practice this week, I'd be pretty concerned that he's not going to be able to create maximal power or run as fast as he can. But we know this injury happened a few weeks ago. That makes me a little bit more optimistic that he's largely over it and it's not going to impact his athleticism as much. That said, we do see a 17% decline in fantasy production for tight ends in the first game after a quad injury. And medical data says that a quad injury carries about a 10-ish% recurrence rate. But this is a unique situation because 17% is a pretty significant decline, but tight ends suck. Like there's a few good tight ends, and then there's not that many more. So I think we would all take Mark Andrews minus a potential 17% over whoever's on the waivers right now. And I believe he plays at 1 o'clock. I could be wrong, but it's a situation where if he plays, just start him because whoever you would pick up off the bench to replace or off the waivers to pick him up is probably not going to do anything or will be completely touchdown dependent. So, it's not a perfect situation for Andrews, but you ride with him if he plays.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point out too. That even like what would be 85% of Andrews is better than pretty much any tight end not named like Kelce. I mean, if you're in a weird spot where you have, I don't know, if you have Hawkinson, then I guess you could make the case to start him over Andrews. But I feel the same way where if he doesn't play, pretty much you wait till the 1 p.m. window. You either have Isaiah Likely as your backup, who Isaiah Likely becomes like a top 12 option if Andrews is out.
Absolutely.
And if Andrews plays, you play him. If he doesn't play and you don't have Likely, then I do like the idea of waiting for like a 4 p.m. game or something. And there is options out there, like even like Hunter Henry, I think is playable. Musgrave is on some waivers out there. So some things to look at. Now, similar situation here as well with Darren Waller. It's weird how it's just like these lower body injuries are kind of popping up for these tight ends. I guess, yeah. I mean, it's Andrews, Kelce, and Waller as well. I'm kind of curious what sort of the analysis on Waller is, especially knowing sort of, I think, the last 2 years he sort of dealt with injuries off and on as well. So I'm curious kind of what the evaluation is there.
Yes, he popped on the injury report yesterday with a hamstring injury that later reports were saying it was more just tightness versus a true injury. But oftentimes with the hamstring, that's how it starts. It starts feeling tight, and then you try working through it, and all of a sudden it's a full-blown injury. With Waller's situation, he's 30. We know that age, especially at 30, healing slows down, tissue elasticity is not as good. The quality of the muscle tissue, especially in the hamstring, is not quite as good as it once was, especially if you have a history of hamstring injuries, which Waller does. These are all factors not in his favor. And then it's a Sunday night game. So even if you're trying to pivot, there's less options to pivot to. But again, this kind of the same analysis if we're looking at this holistically as Mark Andrews. Waller's one of the top tight ends in the game, and he's in an amazing situation where he probably, if he stays healthy, will be the target leader on that team. So you ride with him if he plays. And surprisingly, tight ends do not see much of any drop off in fantasy production in their first game after a hamstring injury. And in fact, over 50% in our sample size on fantasyinjuryteam.com were able to meet or exceed their pre-injury average points per game in that first game after a hamstring injury. So while there's definitely concern for this re-exacerbation and all that kind of stuff, I think you ride with him if he plays, and you just make sure that you can get Daniel Bellinger, Ferguson, Knox, Kincaid, or Conklin if Waller ends up being ruled out. And then you just put Waller into your IR and pick one of those guys up because those are the other Sunday night and Monday night tight ends.
Yeah, that's where I'm at as well. If you have Waller and you kind of have to wait up until, the last minute, I would grab, I'd like Conklin. Conklin's probably like a fringe top 15 guy that you can just throw in there. I mean, like, you're kind of punting tight end regardless if it's not one of the elite guys. What I will ask as well, like, this is kind of, I guess, like, knock on wood, but like I've never pulled a hamstring before. It seems like it's sort of common. I'm just sort of curious, like, because it seems to me like if your hamstring can't go, then your hamstring can't go. But if you like play through it, the re-injury is it just like sprinting straight line? Like, kind of what are you sort of being cautious of if you have a hamstring injury, and kind of how can that affect your performance? Because I know that Kupp has sort of had the hamstring thing going on as well. But yeah, it's something that it seems like it's minor, but it seems like it also lingers a ton.
Yes, a very high recurrence rate, and a lot of that has to do with how hard it is to offload it because it's very involved in even just regular walking, but definitely in running and definitely in sprinting. So if you look at the research on it, the load or the tension on the hamstring increases dramatically when you increase your sprint speed from 80% of your sprint to 100%. That's why receivers are the most affected by this because they are the position group that is able to get up to 100% of sprint speed on more often because it takes 30, 40 yards to get to your full max sprint speed. So running backs often don't get up unless they're breaking a long run. They're not running far enough to get to 100% speed. Same with tight ends because they typically run shorter routes. That's why we see receivers and D-backs get most affected by this injury. Part of the reason that it's so hard to like the recurrence rate is so high is because we don't always know when it's fully healed. Like, pain is one thing. We can test strength, we can test range of motion, but the actual like composition of the muscle tissue, it takes a long time for it to really be the same strength that it once was, if it ever gets there. So it's definitely a very challenging injury that has a lot of factors into why it's so challenging.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it seems like it's not quite soreness, but it's not like a tangible, okay, this thing is torn, we now need to repair it. It's just like, having enough rest and then coming back from it too early. So I did want to touch on Kupp while we're talking hamstrings as well, in terms of just like, so I guess he did it, he pulled it a few weeks ago and then he re-aggravated it. I'm sort of curious your thoughts on like what his timeline looks like now, how cautious he's now maybe going to be with the hamstring, and kind of maybe touch on some of the IR talk as well.
Yeah, I think we'll see him go on IR today. McVay said that that's not out of the question that he'll go on today. We still haven't really gotten a analysis from this specialist that he saw in Minnesota. But one thing that McVay said, if you really read between the lines, he said there may be something going on with the nerve. Now, that's another thing that I have a very tall soapbox that I get on my show all the time with these hamstring injuries, is if there's an issue with the lower body, especially the sciatic nerve's mobility, that the body will protect the nerve by literally sacrificing the hamstring. And it'll do that over and over and over and over again. So when McVay says there may be a nerve thing going on, I'm interpreting that as Cooper Kupp's nerve is stuck. So that's I don't want to get too medical or too crazy here, but that's something that we look for, especially in the PT world. I'm very good at differentiating, is someone's range of motion limitation due to the hamstring muscle, or is it because the nerve is not moving properly? And a lot of times, if there's been a history of a back injury, history of a hip injury, any kind of leg injury, the sciatic nerve can get stuck. Like it needs to move a little bit when your leg goes forward and back. And if it's not, then it runs the risk of tearing, and the body's not going to let that happen. So it'll sacrifice the hamstring. I'm thinking that might be what's going on with Cooper Kupp. I have no way of actually knowing that, but the fact that McVay said there may be a nerve thing going on and that he's going to see a specialist, that may be what's up. But either way, 2 hamstring injuries in a 1 month span in a 30-year-old is not good. It's just not. And they really need to be careful with him. I mean, we saw this with Keenan Allen last year, same age. He had a hamstring injury early in the season, missed a lot of time. I think it was 5 games, then came back right away. He was like, nope, nope, not happening. Missed a couple more games, but then he was able to produce. So if Kupp and the Rams really take their time, do their due diligence with his healing and his rehab, I think they should put him on IR, and then hopefully by week 5, he can come back with a reduced risk of re-injury since they've spent that time resting and rehabbing and healing, and he can still be productive. Now, the re-injury risk will be there the whole season. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. Medical literature says that once you've had a hamstring injury in season, you're at 5 times greater risk of another one that season. There's no way around that, especially in a 30-year-old. But whenever he does hit the field, he should be able to produce pretty well. I mean, he's Cooper Kupp. He's incredible. But these next few weeks are going to be really, really critical in his healing and his ability to get back on the field.
Yeah, and I would just say to sort of if anybody has Kupp out there, that's sort of what I would be looking at is I almost in a way would be fine with him going on IR if I have Kupp at this point. Like I'd almost rather them shut him down for a few weeks and just let him get right. But yeah, that's sort of how I would be treating it. Where I'd assume that he'll be out through the first 4 weeks. He comes back somewhere week 5, week 6, week 7. Probably eases into it the first week, and then you just sort of ride with it. Where he's an older player, there's a risk there, but he is Cooper Kupp, probably is a wide receiver 1 regardless. Now, I did want to get your take on. We do have Terry McLaurin as well, which was kind of this weird one where he's been dealing with turf toe all off season, and now he's 100% off of the injury report. But I guess the thing is that's curious to me is that doesn't mean that like it's not a concern. Like I know it's not on the injury list, so I'm sort of curious your thoughts on like when they take a designation off like that. Does that mean he's truly 100%, or is there still turf toe concerns? Just sort of how do you weigh that?
Sometimes it can be tricky, and as you kind of look into this more and get more experience with the different coaching staffs, you can start to pick up on things. So if we get to Seattle today, I've got a whole thing to talk about Pete Carroll. But anyway, Rivera told us, if we read between the lines, Rivera told us that when Mclaurin had an MRI, I think the quote was, it didn't really show much. That's amazing news because a turf toe, like most injuries, you can grade it 1, 2, 3. A grade 2 injury, you would see something on that MRI for sure. So this tells us at worst, this was a grade 1 injury. Grade 1 injuries are typically classified as little to no true tissue damage, little to no what we call laxity or increased excessive motion that you're not supposed to have. And really little to no loss in the integrity of the tissues or the strength and the structure of the tissues. So to me, that tells me much less likely that this will impact his ability to produce, much less likely that this will linger all season. Could it still linger? Yeah, we've seen that before. But we also saw Calvin Ridley have this similar injury a month or so ago, and we haven't really heard much of it, and he's looked incredible in practice videos. So I think I'm quite a bit more bullish on Terry McLaurin than some people are. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this week they hold him back a little, but for the rest of the season, I like him. I like him a lot, and I think his production is going to be more dependent on Sam Howell rather than this injury.
Yeah, and honestly, that's not something I was aware of. Like, I didn't know that there was different grades of turf toe and how things can linger there, but it does make sense. If it's just like a grade 1 and turf toe is what? It's kind of like jamming your finger, but it's like with your toe.
Not really. So there's there's a number of tissues on the underside of your toe, like that would pretty much like contact the floor when you're standing. And when you walk or run, your toe needs to bend upwards. It's called toe extension. With running up to 90 degrees. So that's a lot of motion it needs to have. And that motion is going to stress those tissues that get injured with turf toe. So if it's a really bad injury, one of two things are going to happen. One, you're going to either completely avoid loading through that toe and your foot's going to turn out when you run or walk, which is going to slow down. You're not going to run as fast or be as quick. The other thing that's going to happen is if it's a really severe injury, and this is kind of what happened with Michael Thomas last year, although it was his second toe and not the great toe, the big toe, is that there's a complete loss of the stability of those tissues. So now that toe can just keep going. It just keeps bending upwards. And now it's not able to act as a mechanism to push off of anymore, to create force with running. So not quite the same as jamming your finger. It's a little bit more significant than that, but in Mclaurin's case, it doesn't sound like it's going to hold him back too much.
Now, you did say you had some takes about the Seahawks. I'm curious, sort of. I guess Kenneth Walker had like a groin designation, and now it's gone. Like, I'm sort of curious. Are we concerned about that? Like, does that sort of thing that lingers? Like, I guess what do we think about the injuries in Seattle?
Yeah, and the first thing I want to hit on is Pete Carroll gives us nothing to go off of ever. Like, let's think back a month or so ago. Zach Charbonnet's shoulder, Pete Carroll says, oh, he's out indefinitely. Well, he was back like a few days later, and he was fine. So Carroll is notorious for just saying something and not even being like relevant to his player's injury. With Ken Walker specifically, he had that groin injury early in the preseason, and he has been back at practice the past several weeks, and then we see him pop up on Thursday on the injury report, and we start to freak out in the Twitter sphere a little bit. We're like, oh no, re-aggravation of the injury, and we know that groin injuries do carry about a 18% recurrence rate, so that's what everyone's initial thought was. But then yesterday, he's off the report, and we learned, oh, that was just a planned rest day. So not a re-aggravation of his injury, just a rest day. I'm not concerned at all. So the groin is quite involved with anything single leg, running, cutting, everything athletic is on one leg. But the groin's on the inside of the thigh, so it's not super involved with lateral cutting. It's really not even that involved with straightforward sprinting. Some of the groin muscles do contribute to that, but to a lesser degree than other muscles. So because of that, we actually see no decline in fantasy production in the first game back from a groin injury for running backs. So, I mean, you probably drafted Walker in the 4th, 5th round as a starter. I think you can do so without really any concern, other than just understanding, a little bit increased risk for re-injury because that's just how groins are. But his injury was over a month ago, so I think he's pretty much over it.
Yeah, I would say anyone out there that has Kenneth Walker, I really wouldn't be concerned. It's also a great matchup, too. They're going to be at home versus the Rams. They're supposed to be, I think they're top 6 in projected points this week. I did also want to ask, I do have a bonus I didn't include on our sheet here. George Kittle, that's one that I've been getting a lot of questions on as well, where he's been dealing with something all offseason, it seems like. He's questionable for week 1. I guess sort of what's the breakdown on what Kittle has been going through and kind of his status for week 1?
His is also a groin, so nice little segue there. So all the things I just said about how the groin's involved with athleticism, it's going to be the same there. Interestingly, we do actually see a little bit of a dip in production in tight ends, but 11%. So again, tight end landscape, not good. Kittle, one of the good ones. If he plays, you're still going to start him, even if you are projecting a slightly less production from him. We see about 11% decline in fantasy production and a 16% decline in snap rate. But like I just said, if he plays, you got to play him because he's better than anybody on waivers.
I guess so. I think the take really with all these tight ends is if you have one of these, I mean, all of them are questionable or whatever. If you have one, have a backup plan in place where it's just like if he can't go, then you have someone you can switch to in that same time slot or a later time slot. And it can really be anybody with a pulse on your waivers. It's tight end. It kind of is what it is. If you have to play Tyler Conklin in week 1, then so be it. Now, What I will ask, kind of, because it seems like he's been dealing with this all offseason. Like, how is this a long-term issue, the groin? Like, how? What's your sort of I guess what's your temperature been on like drafting him the past few weeks? Because he has sort of, I think that they were saying there was something else. I can't remember what it was, but I think it was always like a groin or some kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if it was abdominal, but he's had some things going on here, Kittle, and he does have injury history.
Yeah, and because of his injury history and just kind of where he was falling ADP wise, I personally don't have any shares of him. Um, Injury history is the number one risk factor for future injury. Age is also there. It's like 1A, 1B. So Kittle's got a pretty extensive injury history. And not to say that that would have scared me away completely from drafting him, but I just kind of liked guys like Waller and Goddard going slightly after him a little bit better this year. As far as what else he's got going on, if there is an abdominal component, that really raises the concern because what happens sometimes is with a groin injury, it can lead to a sports hernia, which we hear about. And that would be the abdominal component. Now, how that happens, the groin muscles and the abdominal muscles attach on the pubic bone in a very, very similar spot. Like the abdominals are on top, groin's on the bottom. So if the groin gets injured enough, it can pull really hard on that pubic bone, which can then overstretch and injure the abdominal muscles. And now you've got a sports hernia, and that is very hard to treat conservatively. A lot of times you'll see these guys miss a few games, try to rehab, return, and in game one, oh, injured again. Now I'm going for surgery. So that's something I had not heard, but if that is the case with Kittle, we need to be quite closely monitoring things to see how the development is there. A lot of times, sports hernias do not respond well to rehab, and they need surgery, which is about typically like 8 weeks till return to play.
Yeah, I don't want to throw misinformation out there, but this is the sleeper post that I found. It said Kittle has an abductor strain. It's supposed to be sidelined for the next week. That was August 10th. He had some kind of abductor or adductor strain.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That. So is it ADD or is it ABD?
ADD.
Yeah. So that's the groin muscle.
Adductors.
Okay. All right. So forget everything we just talked about with sports hernias. Yeah. ADD, adductor is just the word for groin muscle.
That makes sense. So it's been bothering him for a while, still bothering him, and now has his week one up in the air. Now I will say, I mean, I guess tight ends do get hurt at a high rate, but it feels insane. If like all of the elite tight ends are hurt, I guess sort of where are we at on Kelce now? So Kelce has a Thursday night game. You'll have a long week going into next week. It's just a hyperextension in the. I'm curious, kind of, what's the background of that injury, sort of what that entails over an entire season, and kind of where you think Kelce stands these next few weeks. Like, is he going to play, as soon as week 2, or is this something that sort of takes longer to come back from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole fantasy football community almost fainted on, I think it was Tuesday, when the reports start coming out. Hyperextended knee, like alarms go right up. Everybody wants more information. Everybody starts speculating. And then later reports are saying like ligaments appear intact. And usually when you hear that, that's correct because the field tests or the training room tests that we can do for knee ligaments are pretty reliable. They're like in the 90% reliability. Every now and then they'll test negative and they'll truly be an ACL tear or whatever in there. But luckily for Kelce, that wasn't the case. And the final diagnosis is just a bone bruise. So with that, the challenge is getting the swelling down. And we know that he was dealing with quite a bit of swelling. That's why he missed the game. What's swelling, the knee will balloon right up. It is a hot spot for swelling. And what'll happen is swelling adds, volume into a fixed amount of space, a relatively fixed amount of space. So you start to lose range of motion. If you don't have full range of motion, very hard to do athletic things. Swelling will also shut down the quad muscle, something we see all the time. It's called quad inhibition, where if there's enough swelling, the quad cannot function as strong or as powerfully. So that's why he didn't play on Thursday. They clearly just couldn't get the swelling down, the range of motion back quick enough. Another week plus, he very well could play next week. That should be a lot of time to get the swelling down with icing, with gentle exercise, with some massage techniques. They may inject him if they need to. I don't know. That's kind of outside of my scope. But if he's able to play next week, I mean, you ride with him, and this is not something that I would expect to linger at all throughout the season. Once he's over this, he's fine. He's good to go.
Yeah, that's nice to know where it's not a acute injury, I guess. Seems like he'll be all right coming back from it. I'd imagine the only concern is just like age and things kind of piling up, but that's also, I mean, you can sort of put that in the case for anybody over the age of like 28, you know?
Yeah, and so like I said a few minutes ago, prior injury and age, two biggest risk factors for injury. Age is there's nothing you can do about either of them.
Yeah.
Age, obviously not in his favor, but he doesn't have that remarkable of an injury history. I mean, he's been an Iron Man in this league outside of, I believe it was his rookie year. He missed quite a bit of time. So, age is against him, but the prior injury is not so against him.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like out of character for Kelce. Now, I will say injuries have been in character for this guy, and I kind of wish I thought about it a little bit more in the offseason because I did remember last year, Christian Watson, the injuries really piled up for him, where it felt like I kept saying because it was so clear that he was playing well. He just couldn't, like, he kept on having these early exits where he'd play like 25% of the snaps, 40%, and I kept saying, like, if he could just stay for an entire game out there, like, he's going to do well. And we saw that happen down the stretch, but now we're struggling to get back there again. I believe it's is it a hamstring with him as well,
Yes,
Watson?
it is. Yep. Yeah. So similar to what we talked about before with hamstrings, the recurrence rate very high. He's now at a 5 times increased risk for another one this season, just per medical literature. And the hamstring, like I was saying, that last 80 to 100% of your top end sprint speed, that's where it gets loaded the most. And Watson's a downfield burner. So this could definitely impact someone like him more than it would someone like Darren Waller, who we talked about before, who's more of a middle of the field guy. He's not playing this week, Watson. He's not, and we'll see if he plays next week. If he does, we see about a 12-ish% decline in fantasy production in the first game back from a hamstring injury specifically for wide receivers, and about a 16% decline in their snap rate. So when he does return, you may expect a little bit of a hit. And depending on your roster construction, he's kind of a wide receiver 3 flex-ish type player. So we may want to circle back to those stats when he does return, and people are going to need to decide, am I willing to take a potential hit of 10, 12-ish% of his fantasy production, or do I have somebody else I can plug in there that I expect to perform better?
Yeah, 100%. Like, Watson is a tough one. Those can also, he can re-injure in the next game. So it's just something to monitor over the early season, I guess, with Watson. Now, I will say I'm out of player names, but if you have anyone else that you feel is worth covering, you can throw out some names. But if not, let me know.
So I think a lot of people are going to want to know about Joe Burrow and what we expect there, just simply because of how bad his injury looked. And they caught that video perfectly to really see how he got injured, and it looked so scary. He got carted off, quickly knew that it wasn't an Achilles, thank goodness. Everything I've seen and heard has been fantastic, and by seeing, there's been plenty of videos of him throwing, and with it being his right calf, he's a right-handed quarterback. Guess where he creates all his power from his right leg to throw the ball. So his calf has to take on a lot of force for him to throw the ball down the field for 60-yard touchdowns to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And everything has looked just fine. He has not changed his mechanics whatsoever. He's pushing off. That calf is contracting forcefully, and he's doing just fine. I expect him to be at his complete normal production. He's not really a running quarterback, so while calves do carry about a 14 to 16% recurrence rate per the medical literature, that's not going to be the case for a pocket passer. If this was Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields, I'd be a little more concerned about a re-injury. But with Joe Burrow, I'm really not that concerned. Of course, there's some increased risk, but not to the same degree as it would be for a running quarterback. And everything's looked great. I think he's locked and loaded for an awesome week 1.
Yeah, I have him somewhere in, like, I think my top 6. I will say as well, I don't want to keep you here for too long, but I do want to ask about Jerry Jeudy as well. Where Jerry Jeudy, it seemed like he was going to go on IR, and then I saw some kind of sort of like podcast clip where Schefter was saying like maybe like mid-season is when he's going to come back. I'm now seeing he's like in the mix. Like he hasn't been ruled out just yet in week 1. I'm not really even sure. I think it's lower body with Jeudy. I guess kind of
Hamstring.
yeah, hamstring, of course. Again, kind of where's your head at with Jeudy right now?
And that was my thought too until just this morning. I'm watching TV and it's like, oh, Jared Judy's questionable. Oh, wow. So that would be a remarkably fast recovery from what looked and sounded like a pretty significant hamstring injury. I don't think he'll actually play. I think this might just be, Denver trying to get their opponent to game plan for him, just to waste time game planning, which you'll see and hear a lot of that. Like that happens. That is part of the strategy in the NFL, is to fib a little bit on your player's status so that other teams need to prepare for them. If he does play, I would expect it to be very limited, both snap rate and production. Just simply because everything we were hearing when the injury occurred, it sounded more like return in week 3, week 4. So you can speed up the timeline to some degree, and some athletes, especially younger ones like Jeudy, who's 24, they can speed up that timeline just because these people are literally built different than the rest of us. But to play this week and to play well, I would be very skeptical of. And if he does play, I would try to find somebody else to put in my lineup instead of him.
Yeah, he'll probably be outside. If he plays, he's probably outside my top 40 wide receivers as a guy you can't really trust. But that is like at least really positive news where it seems like it was kind of murky. He could go on IR. It seems like at worst he'll be near 100% week 3, 4-ish, somewhere in that area. Now I will say one last player, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. That one is interesting where he came back from the wrists a lot earlier than people thought. He was catching with like, and it seems like he was practicing with like this cast on. I'm curious if like he's going to play with it. I remember in like Pee Wee football, you used to see guys who would like, I don't know, like fracture their thumb and they'd be playing with like a cast on and they'd make like a club out of like pads and play with it. I'm kind of curious how long is the risk going to affect JSN? Because I imagine when you're catching balls, like that's a very important thing to have, your wrist intact. So what does that look like? And kind of when do you think he'll be past the stage where a wrist injury would affect his ability to catch a ball?
Yeah, last week he had that hard cast on. I don't think he can play with that. I think he was still out there in practice because he's a rookie and they want him to get reps, learn the offense, chemistry with Gino, all that stuff. I imagine he's going to have either a brace or a wrap on for extra protection, but still allow some more mobility. Now that's going to make it harder to catch with his hands. It's just going to. It's still possible, but it's going to be harder just because there's extra stuff taking up space in your hand. Not going to impact his speed, route running, anything like that, though. So I could absolutely see a world where he's productive because he still gets open. I could also see a world where we see a couple uncharacteristic drops simply because he doesn't have the hand dexterity because he's got a wrap or a brace or something on. So I personally would like to see how he does this week before starting him. But if you're in a situation where you kind of have to start him, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I mean, like I said, this is an upper body injury. It's not going to affect his athleticism whatsoever. We know he's a really nice route runner, can get down the field. He could totally get deep, and Gino could throw one where he can like body catch it for a 60-yard touchdown, and that's awesome. I just think that we might see a drop or two that would be typically uncharacteristic of him if he's got something bulky on his hand.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I guess I'm curious. When do you think he gets to a spot where he no longer needs like any sort of like wrap or bulkiness on his hand? Like, at what point do you think that he just has 2 gloves on his hands?
Not long. I mean, this never sounded like it was a super severe fracture, so he might have something on for 2 weeks, but probably by week 3, he's totally good to go.
Yeah, and that's actually really encouraging because the way that I've sort of talked about it with rookie wide receivers, I mean, even like Jefferson, his rookie year, he was behind Olabisi Johnson a little bit, even in week 1 where he didn't have a full route tree or whatever. So having a glove on or extra wrap isn't really the end of the world for JSN's season long outlook. Now, what else you have at the head there?
I was just gonna say, season long, fine.
Yeah.
fine. Like, I think he's going to ball out this year. I've got him on 2 or 3 teams. I'm really excited.
Yeah, he's like maybe my most drafted guy, so I'm really excited about him as well. But yeah, I appreciate you making time to hop on here. I think this is something that we're probably going to do weekly if people enjoy it, and we can cover the players that are sort of in or out. Because I would say, I mean, this helped me as well, where I'm going to have to do a rankings update in the morning tomorrow, and like I actually have a grasp of what's going on. Where usually I'm kind of like, I don't know, it's a hamstring, he's not going to play. Like, but now I feel like I have a better grasp here, so I do appreciate you making time. I would say if you have anything to plug or any place people could find you, you should let them know here.
Yeah, Twitter or X at Fantasy Injury T. That's me. And then the Fantasy Injury Team is at injury_fantasy. And then you can check us out on podcasts on any platform, Fantasy Injury Team, YouTube, Fantasy Injury Team. And we're just getting our Instagram and TikTok going, but Instagram is Fantasy Injury Team as well. TikTok is injury_fantasy.
All right, sweet. I'll make sure I put those links down below. Again, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate everyone that was watching. Make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like, check out Tom's content, and I will see you guys in the next one.
Stones, like this froze.